Just like Photoshop, Lightroom, and all of these other more professional desktop editors, Photoshop Express has a lot of capability in editing your photos, especially when it comes to exposure. So if you click this button in the middle, the one with the sliders, you get to your exposure settings. So let's go through how each of these works. Each of them will have a slider. You can click auto for it to automatically try to adjust how the app thinks your photo will look best. I generally stay away from using auto. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. With exposure sliding to the right, everything in your image will become brighter. Sliding to the left, everything will become darker, similar to like we've seen in another editing app. With contrast, sliding to the right, the darks will become darker, the brights will become brighter, increasing the contrast. Going to the left decreases contrast, making things flatter. When you decrease contrast, things lose a little bit of saturation as well, compared to, in contrast, when you go to the right and slide to the right and add contrast, they become a little bit more colorful. So I'm going to undo that. Then you have your individual adjustments for the highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks. So these will edit individual parts. So the blacks will just adjust the darkest parts of your image. The whites will adjust the whitest. So if we want to make those stars really pop, we can bring up the whites. The shadows are above the blacks, so brighter than the blacks, but still the darker parts of your image. So bringing those down will probably make that sky look a little bit better. And then the highlights are sort of those higher colors. So bringing this down will definitely bring out some of that information in the sky. So those are your exposure adjustments, and that's how you can fix exposure or get more creative with your exposure by adding or decreasing contrast. Notice that by adjusting the individual things like highlights, shadows, whites, and blacks, you are able to add contrast that way rather than doing it with the contrast slider itself. Next, we have our color effects. So this is white balance, this is saturation. First, you have your temperature. So this is how you adjust your white balance, adding warmth or going to add more blue, which could look pretty cool for this night sky. You also have an auto button, which this is probably the only effect that I would try out the auto a little bit more to see if that works. Tint will add more magenta or more green. And if you're photographing things under things like fluorescent lights, you might have that green in there from the light, and you might need to add a little bit more magenta. I'm going to undo that though. So that's sort of just if you find your photos a little too green or pink, this is where you would fix that. Next, you have vibrance and saturation. I'm going to skip vibrance and go straight to saturation. Increasing saturation adds color to the entire image itself. Decreasing it decreases all of the colors, ultimately all the way to black and white. So this is good if you want to add vibrance to all of your colors. But what is vibrance? Vibrance is a more intelligent way of adding saturation, especially when editing photos of people. It adds a lot of saturation to blues, to greens, not so much to oranges and yellows and skin tones, because you'll find if you use the saturation slider to add saturation to portraits, skin tones can start to look a little wonky. So use the vibrance slider, especially when editing portraits and wanting to add that saturation. Next, we have our effects. Again, this is similar to what we have in our regular Photoshop and Lightroom editors. Clarity will increase the sharpness and the detail, which is really great for this image. It can make things look a little grungy, especially if you're editing portraits, so pay attention to that. Dragging to the left softens things, which is actually nice for portraits. So usually I add some clarity to things like landscapes, nature photo, abstract photos, textures, but if I'm photographing people, I won't add any clarity. Dehaze, this is a great example for using dehaze, perfect for shooting skies, clouds, things that are a little bit hazy, and you want to bring out some of that detail. So dragging this to the right will bring out, look at all that information in the stars now that we have that we didn't have before. We can see the before, complete after. Not all of that is with the dehaze, but if we do undo, redo, you can see how much information is back in the sky. It's similar to what a polarizer filter can do when actually shooting. It increases that saturation and contrast in the sky, so you pull out more of that information, color, and that detail ultimately. After Effects, you have your details, which will zoom in your photo. This is if you want to sharpen your photos or decrease the noise. So as it says, it will zoom in for you so you can see the noise. Depending on the type of phone you have, it might be a little hard to see. But if we drag up the slider, you can see that it adds sharpening, which for this might help because we can see more detail in the sky. But you'll notice as I drag to the right, it gets even grainier. And that's what happens when you want to make an image sharper. It becomes more grainy. So in contrast, if I want to decrease the grain, what I would do is do this reduce luminance noise. So luminance is the unsaturated grain that you see in this image. It might be a little hard for you to see, but in the night sky, in between the stars, you see all those little dots. If I increase the noise reduction, it's going to process it. And you can see how it softens it all and it kind of tries to blend all that grain together. That's what reducing luminance noise will do, which looks good if you want to get rid of the grain, but it also softens your image a little bit. So it does what the opposite of sharpening does, and also sort of the opposite of what clarity will help do, which brings out those details. So you got to be careful with adding too much luminance noise. Color noise is if you have a photo and it's similar, but you'll see lots of little red, green, and blue dots. So in this image, you don't have a lot of that, but when I drag it up, you can kind of see it trying to process. With a lot of raw images, you might get a little bit of color noise that you want to reduce. Sometimes with JPEG images, it automatically adjusts and reduces the color noise in camera. You can double click to zoom out. You can also click the image once to get a full screen view of your photo. You can also rotate to see it better if you want to see it horizontal on your screen. Pinching to zoom in, zoom out, so you get more detail. Clicking again to get our menu. Let's go back. Overall exposure, just to bring up the exposure just a little bit. And I'm happy there. So those are your basic photo adjustments. We'll continue with some more advanced features and editing options in the next lessons.